Hello, my name is Zuzanna Swirad. I am based at the Institute of Geophysics, Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. I am delighted to share with you some thoughts on field sampling strategies for the cosmogenic radionuclide dating. I will focus on the experience gained during my PhD project that I conducted at the Department of Geography, Durham University. I would like to acknowledge my supervisors, Professor Nick Rosser and Dr. Matt Brain, as well as Dr. Martin Hurst from the University of Glasgow, who came out to the field with us and shared his expertise. The study was published in Nature Communications in 2020, so please refer to this publication for more information on the field sampling, laboratory processing, numerical modeling, and the discussion on the landscape evolution. Cosmogenic isotope dating stands out from other dating techniques discussed during the Geochron January workshop last year and this year, because it is a method used on fully erosional rock-coast environments. Before I dive into field strategies, a very quick overview of the cosmogenics in case you're unfamiliar with the technique. So cosmic rays, high energy charged particles, bombard the Earth from space. There are a number of reactions and processes in the atmosphere, but finally the particles reach the surface of the Earth, colliding with atoms in rocks. So-called cosmogenic nuclides are produced in situ. The main products are the radioactive nuclides, beryllium-10, carbon-14, aluminum-26, and chlorine-36, and the stable noble gases, helium-3 and neon-21. Measuring concentrations of these isotopes allows the reconstruction of exposure and boreal ages, erosion denudation and uplift rates, and solid dynamics on timescales from hundreds to millions of years. The choice of a specific nuclide depends on the timescale of interest and the rock type available. For example, rocks containing quartz can be analyzed using beryllium-10 and aluminum-26, while chlorine-36 can be used in feldspar and calcite-rich rocks. Cosmogenic nuclides are used to analyze such phenomena as glacier advance and retreat, fault movements, lava flows, landslides, meteorite impacts, and coastal cliff retreat, which I'm going to focus on today. So in general, higher concentrations of cosmogenic nuclides characterize surfaces that have been exposed for longer durations. In case of radioactive nuclides, if the surface has been buried, the nuclides decay, and their concentration decreases with the rate of decay depending on the nuclide half-life. And so to calculate burial ages and reconstruct the complex exposure and burial history, a combination of two isotopes can be used because of different production and decay rates. Additional important factors to consider while calculating dates from nuclide concentrations are shielding by terrain and water, surface erosion, inheritance, and elevation change. Okay, so how do we use cosmogenic isotopes in rock-coast environments? Let's focus on beryllium-10. We take samples from a shore platform that is located around tidal level seawards from the cliff. We measure beryllium-10 concentration in a rock sample and apply a numerical model to reconstruct when the cliff was at the sample location. What do we need to consider? First, there is a production rate. How many atoms per gram of quartz are produced per year? The cosmogenic nuclide production rate is dependent on the altitude, latitude, and depth of the sample considered. Our study was conducted in the UK. For mid-latitude, low elevation surface site, the production rate is 4.009 atoms per gram per year. Second, the longer exposure time, the more atoms have accumulated. Third, the cosmic flux and consequently the production rate change through time depending on the geomagnetic field intensity. Fourth, we need to consider topographic shielding. The 4-atom production rate is for the surface that is unshielded. Imagine a vertical cliff that is straight along shore. At the time when the cliff was exactly at the location of the sample, half of the sky was occluded by the cliff. Therefore, we need to multiply our concentration by 0.5. As the cliff retreats, the sample is more exposed, and so shielding factor increases, with 1 representing no impact on topography at all. Fifth, there is a water shielding, so the production is lower when the bedrock is covered by water. Here we need to consider both the tides and the relative sea level change. Finally, we need to remember that shore platform erodes. The rock mass now exposed at the surface was below the surface in the past, and so the production was lower in the past. There are a few studies that use cosmogenic isotopes for rock cost research. They use different numerical models to calculate exposure ages from beryllium-10 concentrations. These can be forward or backward models, geometry, or process-based. If we take multiple samples along a cross-shore profile, we can identify the most likely scenarios of cliff retreat by comparing measured and modeled beryllium concentrations. I'm not going to go any deeper into this, but it is an interesting and important part of cosmogenic isotope dating. Let's get to the main focus of my talk, field sampling strategies. The first thing to consider is the study location. This will depend on the research questions we want to ask and on rock suitability. Here I put together the 5 existing cosmogenic studies conducted on active shore platforms. They focused on the rock coasts of Korea, France, and the UK. Rocks were sandstones, flints, and chalk. The studies tried to answer various research questions. For example, the first 2 studies looked at the possibility of the platform being a feature inherited from the earlier high stands of the sea. If the platform was inherited, there would be a massive change in beryllium concentrations at some cross-shore location, with lower concentrations closer to the cliff where the platform was exposed in the Holocene, and higher concentrations seawards where the platform was older, potentially tens or hundreds times older. Some studies aim to calculate mean cliff retreat rates over the millennial timescales and compare it to the present rates to verify whether there has been a recent acceleration in coastal erosion. In our study, we also wanted to understand the relative contribution of surface downwearing and step-back wearing to shore platform erosion. Finally, in the most recent study, Shadrick and others used the method to project future coastal erosion. Okay, so we pick our study location based on the research questions and rock suitability. For our study, we did some preliminary rock analysis to find the best location in the wider area of interest. We collected 5 rock samples from potential sites, described them, and did some basic geochemical analysis. We knew that samples would be challenging because of the very fine grain sizes. We picked 2 sandstone locations, Harty-Roop and Cowbar, at both sides of States Harbor. Because Cowbar has some mining history, we rejected it not to sample surfaces potentially modified by human action. So we ended up with Harty-Roop shore platform as our site for cosmogenic isotope dating. We sampled along a single cross-shore transect. Selection of specific sampling sites was related to our research questions. We collected 6 samples at 50-meter intervals between 50 and 300 meters from the cliff to get the average cliff retreat rates in the Holocene. We then sampled at 10-meter intervals at the distance of 50 to 100 meters from the cliff to see whether cliff retreat was gradual at the shorter timescale. Towards the seaward end of the platform, 2 lower sandstone beds are exposed. We targeted the seaward portion of the platform and sampled it at 10-meter intervals and just above and below the steps to calculate long-term step-back wearing. Step-back wearing is a phenomenon typical for structurally controlled platforms that are composed of multiple rock layers. Detachment of blocks happens episodically during storms. Because of this episodic nature, it is quite difficult to calculate mean step-back wearing rates from observational data that spans years up to decades. Our study was the first to look at the longer-term step-back wearing rates. Then we took 1 sample from the cliff face to account for so-called inheritance, that is some base beryllium-10 concentration present due to low energy muons that penetrate deep into the bedrock. We also took 2 additional samples at 100 meters distance from the cliff to see how important is consistent sampling. I am going to mention it again, but we sampled at the highest point within a 3-meter radius of the ideal location. So at that distance of 100 meters, we took additional samples from a low point and from an ironstone nodule. Finally, we sampled at 20-meter distance from the cliff. That was the point where sandstone bed is exposed from underneath the shale bed. So as you see, depending on the research questions and coastal geomorphology, you pick up specific sampling sites along the transect. So other considerations and good practices. Obviously, it is critical to get permissions from the landowner to take rock samples. This can be local council, national park authority, government, private landowner. Make sure you know who owns the shore platform and apply for the permit to sample. Avoid geovandalism. Leave the site in such a state that it is not obvious that the sample was taken. In our case, once the barnacles repopulate the rock and the cutting edges around it, it will be difficult to see that the sample was taken. The patchy character of shore platform surface helps here. Remember about the tides. Spring tides at full and new moon allow getting to lower elevations and so sampling the oldest sections of the platform. Be consistent in specific location of sample collection. I mentioned that before. We had our idealized cross-shore profile, but for sampling, we would look at the local high point within a 3-meter radius. At one location, we did sample from a low point and an ironstone nodule in addition to the high point. And as you can see, the concentrations are quite different despite the proximity of sample locations. Make the sample shallow. There is an exponential decay of beryllium-10 production with depth, so 5 centimeters is the maximum, preferably use only the top 2 or 3 centimeters. It is important to get enough material to have sufficient quartz grains. Sometimes half a kilogram of the material is enough. Our samples were very demanding, and so we had to take as much as 6 or 7 kilograms at some locations to get 50 grams of pure quartz. Obviously, we would aim to get only as little as is needed to avoid leaving unnecessary marks. How do we get the rock? A saw to divide it into rectangles and a chisel and a hammer to plug the pieces out is a common technique. Be particularly careful when sampling close to the cliff. Getting the unexposed sample to measure beryllium produced due to deep muon penetration can be particularly tricky because we do need a sample from a cliff, from a little cave or something like that. So use a helmet. Spend as little time underneath the cliff as you can. Select a place without overhangs and preferably where the slope is less steep and that looks stable. Have someone further away to observe upper parts of the cliff for signs of crumbling. Don't sample if you have doubts about the safety. Remember to bag the sample. Write sample ID on the bag with the waterproof pen in a few places. Place a piece of paper with sample ID inside the bag. Describe the sample site in a notebook. Take photographs. GPS the site. You may need to return to the site to get more material or to perform other analysis, or you may need the description for interpretation of results. To summarize, cosmogenic radionuclide dating allows the reconstruction of the Holocene coastal cliff retreat. It is a very useful technique, and it is very unique because it allows us to date fully erosional environments. Study location depends on the research question and on rock suitability. Specific sampling locations along the cross-shore transect depend on the research question. And good practices include getting the permissions, avoiding geovandalism, sample collection when the tide is suitable, consistent sampling, and sample and site description. A few references of the rock coast research that included cosmogenic exposure dating. In all of them, there were slightly different strategies, so I encourage you to go through all of them and checking different field and laboratory techniques. Thank you very much.